High on a Himalaya watershed, the men and women of remote communities who rely on the land are working together to forge out a living. Their landscape has been devastated over the years, and to survive, they realize that they have to take extra care of what is left. Local custom has traditionally given little say to women, but now they're listened to and their experience taken into account.
जब हम सबसे पहले जुड़े अंदर से बाहर भी नहीं निकलते थे। सबसे पहले जब हमारी दीदी लोग हमारे घरों में आए तब हम अपने अंदरों से बाहर नहीं निकलते थे। उसके बाद हमने धीरे-धीरे जब हमारे समूह बने तो हम
Women and men need to have an equal voice to protect their environment and increase their prosperity. This is key to the sustainable management of resources, not just in Uttarakhand, but all over the world. There are as many women in the world as men, but in some countries, women have less rights than men and often work harder than men. Almost everywhere, women are paid less and have less opportunity than men. Studies show that when women are given a chance to participate, the environment and natural resources are better managed. Enabling equality helps the natural world to survive and prosper for the benefit of all. The Global Environment Facility, or GEF, is working to improve equal access and opportunity for women and men and girls and boys in all areas of its work. In Cambodia, the Tamay commune have balanced the gender constituency of their planning committees. Women and men together are administering 3 climate adaptation projects with GEF assistance. It was the women who pointed out that improving water quality reduces family sickness, especially among the young. They are also developing a new resilient type of rice that increases food supply and nutrition, and they have found that joint male-female savings groups unite the community to work together on their environment and livelihood. The results are impressive. New schools have been built, rice is now marketed to other villages, and household income has increased significantly. In Uttarakhand, equal representation in the Gramiya Community Project means more maintenance of the ecosystem, which in turn enhances livelihoods. GEF funding has supported rehabilitation and management of watersheds so they can undertake all-season production and protect the ecosystem. This in turn enables them to market their surpluses. The production of pine needle briquettes for cooking is a win-win environmental solution. Now used in more than 9,000 households, it has meant women spend significantly less time collecting firewood and cooking. It has reduced CO2 emissions in the kitchen, preserved trees, and helped prevent damaging forest fires. In Uttarakhand, 20 degraded watersheds are now functioning well, and more than 60,000 acres are under sustainable management, driven and owned by the communities.
Learning objectives. By the end of this module, you will be able to describe the relationship between gender and biodiversity, identify key international commitments on gender equality and biodiversity conservation, explain how gender equality contributes to biodiversity conservation, provide examples of gender-responsive biodiversity conservation initiatives. Point of reflection. Is there a difference in the way women and men manage biological resources? Can you think of an example from your personal experience? Write your reflections down. Overview. 1. How are gender and biodiversity connected? 2. What are the gender gaps in biodiversity management and how can they be addressed? 3. How do gender-responsive approaches contribute to effective biodiversity conservation policies and projects? Click to access each section, and we've done that for you. 1. How are gender and biodiversity connected? Section 1. This section introduces the linkages between gender and biodiversity, focusing on their interconnection. A sneak peek into the numbers. See if you can guess. What percentage of the agricultural workforce in Congo is represented by women? Is it 50, 25, 73, 10? Let's guess. It is 73%. The percentage of women who are economically active in the agricultural sector amounts to 73% in the Congo. According to global data, women comprise 43% of the agricultural labour force. In rural areas, the numbers are even higher. Up to 95% of women living in rural areas are economically active in the agricultural sector, compared to 63.8% of men. However, there are considerable variations from region to region and within countries. For example, in South Asia, women represent only 35% of agricultural workers, while in the Pacific they represent 52%. Women's active role in agriculture is very visible in seed saving, cultivating, and maintaining local crop varieties. Women's central role in household food production is critical to local food and nutrition security and resilience to environmental changes. A sneak peek into the numbers. See if you can guess. When questioned about plants, how many more species were indigenous women from the Amazon forest able to identify in comparison to indigenous men of their communities? 38, 18, 45 or 23? Let's guess. 43%. A study in Amazonia found that, compared with men, women were able to identify a broader range of plant species. For example, trees, vegetables, vines, bushes and herbs, and usable plant parts, for example, fruits, barks, leaves, seeds and roots. Knowledge of a broad range of plant species is particularly important in natural disasters and food crises. In many places, women's familiarity with tree products such as fruits, nuts, medicinal materials and wood fuel plays a crucial role in coping with food shortages. Let's continue. A sneak peek into the numbers. Let's see if you can guess. In fish processing factories surveyed in India, what percent of workers were women? 40, 60, 25 or 10%? I'd hazard a guess. I'd say 60%. Let's see if we were correct. 60%. In fish processing factories surveyed in India, 60% of workers were young women. In Vietnam, women make up 80% of the aquaculture workforce. In West Africa, as much as 80% of seafood is marketed by women. Globally, women's most prominent role in small-scale and industrial fisheries is in post-harvest processing and distribution. However, despite their important role in the fishing community and their dependence on fishery resources for consumption and sale, women are generally excluded from decision-making processes for marine conservation and fisheries management. Let's continue. Key message. The access, use, management, and conservation of biodiversity is not gender neutral. Understanding the ways in which women and men from different social, cultural, and economic backgrounds interact with and use natural ecosystems is essential for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, as well as for advancing gender equality. What are the sources of gender differences and inequalities in biodiversity? Match each description with the corresponding term. Let's start. Gender often determines one's access to and control over land, productive assets, and biological resources. This can have a direct impact on agricultural productivity and investment in sustainable management practices. It may also increase women's vulnerabilities to biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. Is it A. Risks, B. Vulnerabilities, C. Decision-making power, D. Knowledge, E. Rights and access, F. Roles and responsibilities? I'd hazard a guess it would be E. Rights and access. Let's see. That's correct. I've selected the correct response. Let's continue. Exercise. Since women and men use resources differently, they are not necessarily similarly affected by biodiversity loss and changes in management practices. Women typically face greater levels of vulnerability to biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, climate change, and natural disasters than men. Let's see what this corresponds with. I would say that it may be vulnerabilities. Should we try that? B, and submit it. That's correct. Vulnerabilities. We've selected the correct response. Let's continue. Exercise. Time constraints and lower educational levels often lead women to be less directly engaged in decision-making processes related to biodiversity management, conservation, and sustainable use. I would say, let's try D, knowledge, and submit it. Incorrect. You did not select the correct response. The correct answer is decision-making power. Let's continue. Exercise. Differences in the use of resources lead women and men to develop distinct knowledge about biodiversity. Both women's and men's knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, is equally valuable in ensuring the effective conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. In this context, inequalities in access to education, technology, and services need to be taken into account. Let's try D, knowledge, and submit. Correct. That's right. We've selected the correct response. Let's continue. Exercise. Failure to take gender into account in ecosystem management and conservation can perpetuate unequal sharing of benefits, increased social inequalities, and contribute to unintended negative impacts. As a result, women may be further marginalized and the effectiveness of conservation projects decreased. Let's try either risks or roles and responsibilities. I think it would be F, roles and responsibilities. Let's submit that. I did not select the correct response. The correct answer is risks. Let's continue. Exercise. Differences in the activities and tasks performed by women and men shape their reliance on biological resources. A gendered division of labor may result in different attitudes and values towards biodiversity, protection, and management. This is particularly relevant when women are not able to voice their concerns. And that would be F, roles and responsibilities. Let's click on that and submit it. That was correct. The correct answer is roles and responsibilities. Let's continue. Access, control, benefits from biological diversity. In a community, the rules that govern access to and control over biological diversity, as well as how the benefits are shared, may vary. Hover over access. Access to resources implies the right or the opportunity to use those resources. It also entails the social organization of production, foraging, storage, and exchange. When communities are occupying the same areas, most of the time there are well-developed rules regarding the farming of land and the gathering of forest or fishing products. Control. Control over natural resources entails the ownership, decision-making, and management of such resources. Control is determined by social and cultural norms, as well as the laws that govern the ownership of natural resources, the allocation of power to take decisions, and the collection and use of natural resource revenue. Benefits. Biodiversity offers a wide range of social, economic, and environmental monetary and non-monetary benefits to individuals and society. It provides ecosystem services such as water purification and climate moderation that enhance the productivity of agriculture, forests and fisheries, and improve human health. Now let's add gender to the mix. Hover over the elements to find out more. Access. In many parts of the world, women are excluded from consultation processes and the design and implementation of biodiversity-related initiatives. Even when they are not formally excluded, women may be reluctant to speak in the presence of men or outsiders because of existing gender cultural norms regarding age, ethnicity, or social status. Moreover, the women most likely to be consulted are often part of the local elite, whose concerns may be different to those of poorer women. Control. In many countries, custom prohibits women from owning land. In many cases, women only have land use rights mediated or controlled by men. Under customary laws, forest and lands are owned by their communities, and indigenous women often do not have the motivation to invest in conservation practices. These gender inequalities are not only a developing country problem. For instance, in 2007, only 28.7% of farm holders in the European Union were women. Benefits. Men are more likely to be involved in the commercialization of natural resource products, for example, timber harvesting, coffee farming, which is more visible and considered more valuable than women's domestic work, for example, collecting water, home gardening. Even though women's work contributes to the stream revenue and the well-being of all family members, their contributions tend to go unnoticed. Women and men are more likely to make environmentally sound land management decisions when they have secure ownership and know they can benefit over the long term. How do women contribute to biodiversity conservation? Let's learn more. The role of women as crop producers and primary managers of traditional seeds, forest resources, and medicinal plants. Entrepreneurs, building businesses based on the sustainable use of biological resources. Innovators who contribute to community efforts to reduce pressure on natural resources and enhance ecosystem functions and services. Their knowledge can also be applied as alternative sources of information, like learning from the traditional cooking recipes used by women in Yucatan, Mexico. Knowledge brokers, Women and men have complementary knowledge and perceptions of their natural environment and the biodiversity around them. Managers. Women, as well as men, are managers of biological resources and can provide valuable input in planning and implementing conservation initiatives. Indigenous peoples and biodiversity. Local communities' knowledge, innovations and practices are relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Indigenous women and men play a critical role in biodiversity conservation, given their often direct dependence on natural resources, their intimate knowledge of ecosystems, and the sustainable management practices accumulated over generations. Projects and policies that create protected areas, restrict natural resource use, and or develop new natural resource management regimes need to ensure that Indigenous peoples, including women, are included in the development and consultation process. Gender, Indigenous peoples and biodiversity. What are the issues and challenges? How can these challenges be addressed? What are the issues and challenges? Globalization is challenging for Indigenous women and men, but particularly for women. Their role as caregiver is devalued if they do not make a direct financial contribution to the family income. Furthermore, the land exploitation by multinational corporations or Indigenous peoples' territories has limited women's access to natural resources necessary for their and their families' livelihoods. Land, territory, natural resources and conflict. Indigenous peoples' territories often contain rich natural resources, which make them particularly attractive and vulnerable to conflict. As other parties move in to capitalize on these resources, Indigenous groups can lose access and control over their traditional lands. This has an impact on their vital synergy with the environment and may threaten their rights. These situations also increase the vulnerability of Indigenous women who lose their traditional livelihoods. How can these challenges be addressed? 1. Increase the participation of Indigenous women in policy making and decision-making bodies, as well as in teaching institutions and environmental agencies. 2. Implement recommendations of international declarations that recognize the crucial role of Indigenous peoples in environmental preservation. 3. Promote capacity building and empowerment of Indigenous women. Support them in becoming community advocates. Key message. Due to biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, it is now more urgent than ever to ensure that women and men are able to engage as equal partners and play active roles in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Overview. 2. What are the gender gaps in biodiversity management and how can they be addressed? Dimensions of biodiversity, conservation and management. Learn more about how gender inequalities affect biodiversity, conservation in forestry, fisheries, agriculture and protected areas. How these inequalities can be addressed. And section 2 is all about from a gender perspective. Let's go. Biodiversity, gender differences and gaps. The term gender gap refers to any disparity and inequality between women's and men's condition due to their position or role in society. It concerns inequalities in terms of their participation, their access to opportunities, rights, power to influence and make decisions, incomes and benefits, and control and use of resources. Gender differences increase gender-based inequalities and accelerate the depletion of natural resources and the degradation of ecosystems. Such differences and gaps need to be addressed at all levels of society and require committed action. Efforts to incorporate gender issues into biodiversity, policy and projects are underway, but more has to be done. Continue to explore gender differences and gaps in 4 key areas. Point of reflection. Can you think of an example of how gender inequalities affect biodiversity conservation? Write your reflections down. Explore gender differences and gaps with regard to access to, control of and benefits from biodiversity in various economic domains and thematic areas: forestry, agriculture, fisheries, protected areas, biodiversity, gender differences and gaps. Let's click on the keywords to find out more. Forestry. Across the world, women and men often have distinctive roles associated with access to and benefits from collection and sale of forest products. Globally, women's forest knowledge tends to be more linked to household, health, and food consumption. This knowledge, which is particularly important during food crises, often goes unrecognized. Men's knowledge is generally associated with commercial uses and thereby compensated monetarily. This generates and perpetuates inequalities in income and power, as well as control and access to benefits. Forest management groups with a significant proportion of women in Latin America, Africa, and Asia show better results in terms of collaboration, solidarity, conflict resolution, and collective action. They also report higher levels of forest health. Benefits of empowerment. Empowering women in the forest sector can create sustainable benefits for them, their households, and communities. Women's participation in forest-related decisions can maximize the contribution to food security from forests. For example, women often have substantial knowledge on the identification, collection, and preparation of forest foods. This can complement agricultural production and add nutritional value to family meals. Integrating a gender perspective in biodiversity policies and projects. Include gender issues in socio-economic analysis and outlook studies on the forestry sector. Encourage research of sex disaggregated data. Promote participatory methodologies for men and women to generate income from forests in order to reduce poverty and to sustainably manage natural resources. Develop and implement approaches that increase the equitable participation of men and women in forest-related processes and activities. Promote equitable forest tenure systems through policies and laws that improve access to forest resources for the benefit of men and women. Agriculture. Women in agriculture, 43%. On average, women provide more than 43% of the agricultural labour force in developing countries. However, in many regions, due to discriminatory social norms and laws, they do not have land rights, enjoy limited access or control over resources, and are underrepresented in rural organizations and institutions. As a consequence, Women's voices are rarely heard in decision-making processes for community-owned lands, and thus only receive 5% of agricultural services worldwide. Benefits of empowerment: 20%. If women had the same access to productive resources as men, the yields of their farms could increase by 20 to 30%. This, in turn, could increase agricultural outputs in developing countries by up to 4% and potentially reduce the number of malnourished people by 100 to 150 million. 26%. Closing the gender gap in labour markets of 95 countries will increase the GDPs of each respective country by at least 9%, and the global GDP by as much as $28 trillion or 26%. Fisheries. Women in fisheries across the world: 47%. On average, 47% of the 120 million people who work in the capture fisheries and post-harvest sectors are women. In aquaculture, this figure is up to 70%. 85%. While women represent 85% of employees involved in tasks such as evisceration, filling boxes, or other processing tasks, few occupy managerial positions. 5.4 million. Women accounted for 5.4 million of the 45 million people engaged full-time or part-time in the primary fisheries and aquaculture sector in 2008, which means that they represented 12% of the sector's total workforce. Gender roles and benefits of empowerment. Roles in the fisheries sector are often divided along gender lines. For instance, harvesting fish in coastal and deep sea waters is almost always a male-dominated activity. Women in fishing households perform preparatory work, such as mending nets, which is rarely remunerated and not considered to be real work. One of the most current activities for women in the fisheries sector is reef gleaning, which supplies many women with a considerable portion of their daily household diet and nutritional input. Women's most prominent paid role is in post-harvest processing and distribution. Highlighting and valuing the important roles that women play in fisheries is an important step to women's empowerment. Giving a formal status to their contribution and work and providing them with access to key services and resources is vital for sustainable fisheries management. Integrating a gender perspective in biodiversity policies and projects. Strengthen women's fisheries organizations and networks to promote women's working conditions and rights. Improve the gender balance and women's participation in training and capacity building in fisheries production and management. Ensure that the issues related to women's rights and empowerment are part of the discussion in policy development on fisheries and aquaculture, particularly at national and regional levels. Develop gender-sensitive indicators to measure and assess the contribution of small-scale aquaculture to sustainable rural development with sex disaggregated data. Strengthen gender awareness and sensitivity of staff in agencies who are responsible for developing or delivering fisheries projects to ensure men and women in target populations benefit equally. Integrating a gender perspective in biodiversity policies and projects. Advocate for equal access for men and women to and control over land. Promote equal access to resources and opportunities by establishing gender action plans in agricultural institutions. Develop gender mainstreaming strategies, based on good gender analysis for policies and projects. Ensure all agricultural policies and projects are gender responsive and make women's voices heard in decision making at all levels. Organize gender awareness and sensitivity training for agricultural extension workers and train or hire more female agricultural extension workers. Protected areas. Gender roles and division of labour related to protected areas. Gender issues are often overlooked in wildlife conservation efforts, as well as in the management of protected areas. This is reflected in the corresponding decision-making processes. Factors that influence sustainable wildlife management, such as human-wildlife conflicts, illegal trade, poverty, and livelihood security, have significant gender dimensions. For instance, activities usually performed by women, such as collecting water and firewood, expose them to the risk of being attacked by wild animals in communities bordering protected areas. Benefits of empowerment. Recognizing women's deep knowledge of natural resources and their potential as agents of change for sustainable development can simultaneously increase the effectiveness of conservation efforts, while also ensuring empowerment and gender equality. In the Biological Reserve of Vizcaíno in Baja, California, Mexico, women have been trained as lookouts for whales. This has provided them with skills in marine environment conservation, as well as with a new source of income. These women have also become models for younger generation of women and men. Integrating a gender perspective in biodiversity policies and projects. Ensure women's leadership and participation in protected areas design and management. Conduct a gender analysis to identify how women and men interact with their environment when using and managing natural resources in protected areas. Consider the differences and inequalities that the analysis reveals by designing targeted actions, conducting appraisals, allocating budgets, planning activities, and analyzing sensitive indicators to evaluate results. Provide training and sensitizing sessions on gender equality to all the key actors involved in project management. Key message: biodiversity conservation is enhanced by incorporating women's knowledge and skills and improving their participation and leadership in policy and project design and implementation. 3. How do gender-responsive approaches contribute to effective biodiversity conservation policies and projects? Let's see. Section 3. Gender and Biodiversity, International Frameworks and Actions. Learn more about how gender considerations have been integrated in international commitments, national policies, projects, and local initiatives to conserve biodiversity. Key message: mainstreaming gender into biodiversity research, management, policies, strategies, and actions is key to ensuring healthy societies and a sustainable relationship between people and the environment. Gender mainstreaming. International. The Convention on Biological Diversity, 2015 to 2020 Gender Plan of Action. The Convention on Biological Diversity is a key international instrument that highlights the importance of biodiversity and the importance of implementing conservation practices while keeping socio-economic development in mind. Decisions adopted under the Convention recognize gender as an important lens to understand and take action to address the complexities of biodiversity conservation, sustainable use of the components of biodiversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of genetic resources. 2015 to 2020 Gender Plan of Action. The plan pursues 4 strategic objectives: to mainstream a gender perspective into the implementation of the Convention, to promote gender equality in achieving the objectives of the Convention and related frameworks, to demonstrate the benefits of gender mainstreaming in measures towards the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources, and to increase the effectiveness of the work under the Convention. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, entered into force in 1981. It brings women into the focus of human rights concerns, focusing on the meaning of equality and how it can be achieved. It establishes an international Bill of Rights for women, as well as an agenda for countries to guarantee the enjoyment of such rights. A guide to the Convention Gender Plan of Action, 2015 to 2020 Gender Plan of Action Pocket Guide, Summary and Examples. For information on decisions and recommendations on gender under the Convention, please see the publication Gender and Biodiversity Technical Guide. How are gender, Indigenous peoples and local communities' perspectives addressed in the Convention? Full participation, recognizing the vital role that women play in the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and affirming the need for the full participation of women at all levels of policy making and implementation for biological diversity conservation. Knowledge, innovation and practices. Subject to its national legislation, respect, preserve and maintain knowledge, innovations and practices of Indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and promote their wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge, innovations and practices, and encourage the equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of such knowledge, innovations and practices. CBD, the Nagoya Protocol. The Nagoya Protocol aims at sharing the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources in a fair and equitable way, including by appropriate access to genetic resources and transfer of relevant technologies. It makes specific reference to the vital role of women in access and benefit sharing, with a particular emphasis on Indigenous women. Click on the articles to find out more. Article 22.5J and Article 12.3. Article 22.5J emphasizes the need to enhance Indigenous and local communities' capacity, particularly women within those communities, in relation to access to genetic resources and traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. Article 12.3 requests parties to support, as appropriate, the development by Indigenous and local communities, including women within these communities, of a. community protocols in relation to access to traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of such knowledge. B. Minimum requirements for mutually agreed terms to secure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. And C. Model contractual clauses for benefit sharing arising from the utilization of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. CBD Cartagena Protocol. The Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety aims to ensure the safe transfer, handling, and use of living modified organisms, LMOs, resulting from modern biotechnology that may have adverse effects
on biological diversity, also taking into account risks to human health, public awareness of biosafety, public participation in decision-making, and socio-economic considerations arising from the impact of LMOs on biodiversity are key areas of the protocol, where gender considerations are important. Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. Aichi Biodiversity Targets and Gender. Within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, gender equality and women's empowerment are both a stand-alone goal and a critical cross-cutting component of the goals. Biodiversity also has a cross-sectoral relevance and features prominently across many of the SDGs and associated targets. Let's click on the goals to explore more. Sustainable Development Goals. 1. No poverty. End poverty in all its forms, everywhere. 2. Zero hunger. End hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. 5. Achieve gender equality. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. 14. Life below water. Conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas and marine resources for sustainable development. 15. Life on land. Protect, restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, NBSAPs. National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, NBSAPs. The Convention requires parties to prepare National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, NBSAPs, or equivalent instrument, as the principal instrument to implement sustainable resource management at the national level and to integrate it into the planning and activities of all sectors that can have impact on biodiversity. Why is it important to mainstream gender into NBSAPs? To ensure that the diverse knowledge, needs, and priorities of women and men are applied to reverse the loss and unsustainable use of biodiversity in actions at national and local levels. 46% of NBSAPs submitted following the adoption of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020 included some references to gender or women's issues, with 34% identifying gender perspectives as part of national targets or actions. 2015 to 2030 NBSAPs. To find out more on how to integrate gender into NBSAPs, please access the following: Integrating Gender Considerations in National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, Ecuador's National Biodiversity Strategy, Gender and Biodiversity Joint Gains, Myth or Reality. All three of those will be available on the unccelearn.org site. Good practices at national level. Click on the pins to access case studies of gender-responsive NBSAPs. In 2016, the IUCN Global Gender Office, GGO, and the Secretariat of the CBD, with support from the Government of Japan, implemented a pilot project to build the capacity of developing countries to integrate gender into their NBSAPs. This process took place as part of the revision of such plans to align them to the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. The project conducted 3 country initiatives in Mexico, Uganda, and Brazil. NBSAP, Mexico. Gender-responsive strategies to empower Mexican women as stakeholders for biodiversity conservation. Mexico's NBSAP 2016 includes women's and gender considerations within its main strategic goals. 5 of the 6 strategic goals advance women's participation in projects, take women's traditional resource knowledge into consideration, or promote a gender perspective in biodiversity, conservation, and education. Gender-related activities and perspectives are addressed across the NBSAP, including in indicators and the monitoring and evaluation system. NBSAP Brazil. The role of women in biodiversity, conservation, preservation, and restoration. Brazil's NBSAP 2018 pays particular attention to supporting women's participation in decision-making processes, as well as women's inclusion in payment for ecosystem services. The NBSAP further highlights gender mainstreaming as a key criterion for monitoring implementation, accompanied by the collection of sex disaggregated data to better understand gender gaps and guide more gender-responsive actions. Brazil's national multi-stakeholder platform, which monitors and supports implementation of the country's biodiversity targets, established a gender thematic group. NBSAP Uganda. Over 30 new activities with gender-responsive indicators and budgets. Uganda's NBSAP Objectives 2016 aim to enhance engagement of local communities in gender-responsive biodiversity conservation, address gender equality in the fisheries sector, and promote an environmental policy framework supporting women's access to and control over resources in the water and sanitation sector. The NBSAP also includes a series of activities with respective indicators and budgets that are gender responsive, including undertaking gender analyses and developing a gender-responsive monitoring and evaluation strategy, training for women, and support to women's businesses. Local project. Good practices at the local project level. We'll click on the pins to access case studies of gender-responsive projects and initiatives. To find out more, please access GEF's Guidance to Advance Gender Equality in Projects and Programs. These are all available as downloads on this platform. Protected Areas, Guyana. Community action on mangrove restoration to overcome extreme weather vulnerabilities. Case study. Issue. In Guyana, a country where coastal areas can reach 1.04 meters below sea level, 90% of the population lives along the coasts. These low-lying communities are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, as well as extreme weather conditions. The current infrastructure is not sufficient to protect the population from weather-related threats, and women are disproportionately affected by the impacts of flooding and coastal erosion. Action. The project addressed the threats to coastal communities by involving community members in the cultivation of mangroves. The purpose was to create a buffer against storm events, to reduce the force of the waves and decrease erosion. Women were targeted as project beneficiaries. Their leadership was prioritized, and they were provided with economic resources as well as training for mangrove seedling cultivation. Impact. Women accounted for 80% of participating community members. Women successfully organized village mangrove action committees and were empowered in roles as environmental leaders. Over 460,000 mangrove seedlings were planted, restoring over 10 kilometers of coastal mangrove forests, and the resilience and security of coastal communities was increased. Fisheries. Gambia. Gambian women, from poverty to resilience through oyster collection. Issue. Oyster collection in the Gambia is mostly carried out by female harvesters. This is their sole source of income and a seasonal endeavour from March to June. It is a physically tedious and risky occupation, as women do not know how to swim, and the harvesting takes place by the roots of mangrove forests close to water. They use rudimentary tools such as machetes and frequently over-harvest, which damages the mangroves. Action. In order to tackle this issue, the TRY Women's Association, supported by the GEF Small Grants Programme at UNDP, works with around 500 female harvesters under an organized structure that includes 15 villages in the Greater Banjul area. By grouping in cooperatives, members gain training and exchange knowledge on sustainable practices. They can also sell their products under a shared brand with a specific set of standards. Impact. This collaboration has produced multiple environmental, social, and economic outcomes. The state of the mangrove forests has improved due to calculated harvesting and training, sustaining the health of the ecosystem. The extended length of the closed season has allowed oysters to increase in size, leading to a 30% higher market price. Also, the communities have diversified their income through training and education on various subjects such as English and financial skills. Cameroon. Agriculture. Cameroon. Advancing women's empowerment through environmental protection and sustainable agriculture. Issue. In the northwest province of Cameroon, unsustainable agricultural land use practices are still being used. Such practices include traditional slash and burn, which increases the destruction of natural resources and leads to increased poverty as well as heightened gender inequality. Action. The Ntanka Village Women Common Initiative Group, an organization that focuses on gender empowerment, livelihood improvement, and HIV/AIDS care, implemented the Grassroots Women Environmental Protection and Poverty Alleviation Project, with support from the GEF Small Grants Programme and other donors. The project included the delivery of multiple workshops on natural resource management and appropriate farming techniques, and established an environmental documentation center for women's continuous education. Impact. The project has led to the empowerment and training of 190 women in environment-related issues, which has also helped them to increase their income through sustainable agricultural practices such as the reduced use of synthetic fertilizers. Soil erosion has decreased while crop yield has increased. Women have been further empowered through active group participation and the use of democratic practices, and have gained a better understanding of their economic contribution to the household and community. International. The Convention on Biological Diversity, 2015 to 2020 Gender Plan of Action. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, entered into force in 1981. It brings women into the focus of human rights concerns, focusing on the meaning of equality and how it can be achieved. It establishes an international Bill of Rights for women, as well as an agenda for countries to guarantee the enjoyment of such rights. A Guide to the Convention Gender Plan of Action, 2015 to 2020 Gender Plan of Action Pocket Guide, Summary and Examples, is available on this download. For information on decisions and recommendations on gender under the Convention, please see the publication Gender and Biodiversity Technical Guide. How are gender, indigenous peoples and local communities' perspectives addressed in the Convention? Knowledge, innovation and practices. Subject to its national legislation. Respect, preserve and maintain knowledge, innovations and practices of indigenous and local communities, embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and promote their wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge, innovations and practices, and encourage the equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of such knowledge, innovations and practices. Full participation, recognizing the vital role that women play in the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and affirming the need for the full participation of women at all levels of policy making and implementation for the biological diversity conservation. And you, point of reflection. What will you do in your own work? Share your thoughts and ideas and write your reflections. Module summary. Existing gender inequalities lead to biodiversity loss and accelerate the depletion of natural resources. Women and men have different knowledge needs and priorities related to biodiversity, which must be brought to bear in policies and projects to effectively reverse the loss and unsustainable use of biodiversity. Empowering women to play an active role in biodiversity conservation can create significant sustainable development opportunities and increase the effectiveness of conservation efforts in different sectors, while also advancing gender equality. The importance of taking a gender-responsive approach in biodiversity management has been recognized across a range of global commitments with implications at national and local levels.